Dust rolled lazy over the town of Bitter Creek, Montana, settling into the creases of window panes and the cracks of every quiet soul who dared call it home. The wind that day carried no news, no mercy, only the memory of what had once been a life worth speaking of, and the broken remnants of a girl who no longer wept. She lay crumpled in the dirt like a rag doll thrown from a porch. One leg bent the wrong way beneath her faded cotton dress, the other smeared with bruises that had turned plum dark with time and pressure. Her hands were scraped raw. Her hair, thick and chestnut, clung in matted strands to her cheeks. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just breathed, shallow, slow, as if even air had grown heavy. The sky above was kind enough to cloud over, sparing her the cruelty of sun in her eyes. No one approached her. Inside the general store, old Mrs. Harlan glanced through the dusty glass, then turned away. The preacher's boy watched from the church steps, his knees knocking nervously before his mother yanked him by the collar and hissed a warning. The sheriff lit his pipe on the boardwalk, exhaled, and said nothing. Her name was Clara June Tanner, 16. Though life had taught her far more than her years permitted, she'd come to Bitter Creek on a wagon with her husband Amos the year prior. A quiet man, Amos was the kind who'd sweat through his shirt before breakfast, but never raise his voice past a whisper. He'd buried his mother with his own hands and married Clara that same summer. Folks said he was lucky. She had eyes like twilight mist, soft, slow, and full of things she never said. But Amos was taken by a fever that first frost. Left in the hands of his kin, Ruth and Ezra Tanner, whose kindness ran as thin as the creek come August. She stayed out of duty, and perhaps because no one ever told her she could leave. At first, they simply ignored her, let her eat only what she cooked, sleep where the light didn't reach. But grief curdles in cruel hearts, and within months, their bitterness became fury. Ruth accused her of laziness. Ezra accused her of theft. When Amos's hunting knife went missing, likely pawned by Ezra himself, he beat Clara until her lips split and blamed the storm for the bruises. No one questioned it. Last night it came to a head. Ezra stormed in, reeking of whiskey, yelling about disgrace. Ruth, her face a red mass of rage, called Clara a burden and worse. They dragged her from the barn, screamed of stolen food, dishonor, sin, and when her foot caught in the boards and snapped a sound that echoed like a shot, they did not stop. They loaded her into a buckboard like so much trash and rode into town. They left her at the saloon steps as if the town might sweep her up with the dust. That was 6 hours ago. The silence around her had become a second skin, her breath shallow, her mind drifting somewhere quieter, somewhere before. When she still hummed to herself while hanging laundry, when Amos carved her a whistle out of cedar and called her little lark, she remembered his hands calloused but warm. She remembered her wedding shoes borrowed, ill-fitting but clean. She remembered the promise in his eyes even if he never said it aloud. Now her dress clung wet to her thighs with sweat and dried blood. The earth beneath her smelled of horse piss and tobacco. Every nerve in her body begged for stillness, for forgetting. Then the wind shifted. A single boot scuffed in the dirt beside her, then another. She didn't look up. He crouched beside her slowly, like one might approach a spooked colt. His shadow covered her face, blotting out the grimy heat of the sky. "You breathin'?" the man asked. His voice was rough, low-worn like an old fence post, not unkind. She blinked once. He nodded, then carefully placed his arms beneath her, one at her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She flinched hard, groaning through gritted teeth as the pain roared back. "I got you," he said simply. He lifted her like she weighed less than the grief she carried. The scent of tobacco and pine clung to him, and his coat scratched against her cheek. She opened her eyes just long enough to see the edge of a gray beard, the line of a jaw that hadn't smiled in a decade. The man carried her past the saloon, past the gawkers, who pretended not to stare, past Sheriff Boone, who started to step forward but paused, recognizing him. "Caleb," the sheriff said quietly. "You sure?" The man gave no reply, just kept walking. They crossed Main Street. The boards creaked beneath his weight. A dog barked in the distance. Behind the livery, the land sloped up toward the ridge where an old cabin sat nestled between lodgepole pines and high grass. The paint had long peeled. The fence sagged, but the chimney smoked, and the porch was swept clean. Inside, the man laid her gently on a narrow bed. The sheets were rough muslin, the pillow cool. She tried to sit up, failed, and instead focused on the ceiling beams above. "Name's Caleb Ward," he said, breaking the silence. "Ain't much of a talker, but I know how to boil water and bind a wound." "You got a name?" She didn't answer. He didn't press. He fetched a pail, filled it with well water, and set it to boil. As the steam rose, he found an old hunting knife and sliced through the seam of her dress along her broken leg. Her foot was swollen blue-black, the bone beneath the skin angled wrong. He touched her ankle with 2 fingers. She bit her lip to keep from screaming. "I'm gonna set it," he said. "Won't lie, it'll hurt like hell." She nodded faintly. He poured whiskey on the break, then on his hands, then into a chipped cup and offered it to her. She drank, coughed, gasped. The burn brought tears to her eyes for the first time in weeks. And then he pulled. Her scream echoed out the cabin and down the hill like a mourning dove in pain. But it was clean. The kind of scream that cuts something loose inside. She passed out before he finished the splint. When she woke, night had come. The window let in the scent of pine. A candle flickered near her elbow. She turned her head and saw Caleb asleep in a wooden chair, arms folded across his chest, boots still on. The pain was sharp but distant, like thunder after lightning. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked. She tried to speak but found nothing to say. Over the next day, he changed her bandage, spooned at her broth, never asked questions. When she tried to rise, he caught her gently and whispered, "Not yet." When she stared blankly at the ceiling, he read from an old book with half the pages torn out. He had a way of filling silence without breaking it. On the third day, she spoke. "Clara," she said. He looked up. "My name." He nodded once, then returned to sharpening his knife. The world outside continued on. The town whispered. Some called her a harlot. Some said Caleb had gone mad from grief. Others watched the ridge with squinted eyes and shook their heads. No one visited. The wound on her leg throbbed less each day, but the wound in her chest, the one left by betrayal, abandonment, bled quietly beneath the surface. One morning she found a sprig of lupine tucked beside her bowl of soup. No note, just the flower. She stared at it for a longer time before tucking it behind her ear. Later that afternoon she asked, "Oh, why'd you help me?" Caleb stirred his coffee. "You look like someone no one prayed for." That didn't sit right. The words sat between them, warm as a fire in town. Ezra and Ruth Tanner told a different tale, claimed she'd run wild, that she stole silver and seduced old men. The preacher nodded politely. Sheriff Boone said he'd seen no such thing. The town moved on, but on the ridge, in that slant-roofed cabin, something small stirred, a thing slower than love and softer than pity, a kind of remembering of what it meant to be seen. And for the first time in a long while, Clara let herself sleep without fear of waking. She was still broken, but now she wasn't alone. The days passed like slow-moving clouds, shifting quietly, edged with a kind of aching light that couldn't yet be named. Clara lay in the cabin beneath rough-hewn beams, listening to the wind touch the windows, and pines creaked gently against the world. Her leg throbbed at night, and her thoughts even more. But here in this quiet place that smelled of wood smoke and boiled roots, time didn't press her. It unfolded. Caleb Ward moved around her with the practiced stillness of a man who'd lived alone too long. He did not hurry. He rarely spoke, but he tended the fire before she ever stirred. And the moment she opened her eyes, there would be water on the table broth heating on the stove, and her name in the air without being said. He was older than he looked. Life had chiseled him hard and deep, and what remained was a man built of silence and stubborn mercy. His hands, broad and worn, could split logs with one swing, but they steadied her cup with careful patience. Clara noticed everything in fragments. The way he paused before entering the room, the way he turned away when she tried to dress herself, how he cleaned his rifle, even when no one came near the ridge. On the fifth morning, as frost silvered the grass and the creek whispered low, Caleb stood with a leather strap in hand and a small pair of crutches he'd shaped himself. The wood was sanded smooth, oiled with pine sap, and tied at the joints with rawhide. Clara looked at them, then him, then back again. "Time to try," he said. Her body resisted, muscles unused to bearing weight trembled under her nightgown. He moved to her side, steady as earth, and when she took the crutches, his hand brushed her shoulder without flinching. Pain flared sharp as a branding iron. But she gritted her teeth and stood only for a second, but the breath she drew after felt different, earned. They said nothing more that day. Outside, the world stirred. Bitter Creek yawned beneath thin clouds. The gossip hadn't stopped. Whispers slithered down church pews and over poker tables. That old tracker's gone soft. That Tanner girl must have bewitched him. The sheriff had ridden up once, boots crunching on frost, but he left without knocking. There were some men you didn't press without cause. Inside the cabin, life returned not with thunder, but with rhythm. Clara folded her own blankets, learned to hobble toward the stove. She peeled apples one-handed and added herbs to the stew. When Caleb's back was turned, when he found a warm biscuit on his plate one morning, he didn't ask, just nodded and ate. She learned that his wife had died 5 winters ago, childbirth swift and merciless. He never said it outright, but her name was carved into a cedar plank above the hearth, and sometimes at night he stared at it longer than necessary. There was a shawl untouched hanging behind the bedroom door. She never asked about it. She never would. One afternoon, as pale light spilled like cream across the floorboards, she watched him whittle. His knife moved with careful grace, shaping a scrap of maple into the curve of a bird's wing. He didn't speak unless he had reason. But that day, perhaps the silence grew too heavy. "You still afraid?" he asked, eyes fixed on the carving. She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think I forgot how not to be." He set the knife down. "That's all right," he said. "Fear ain't a weakness, just a thing you carry till you don't." The moment hung between them, not fragile, but honest. Clara began to change in small ways. She brushed her hair. She swept the porch. She watched the ridge trail from the window and didn't flinch every time the wind moved. Her voice, once paper-thin, now had roots. Sometimes she sang quietly, almost without noticing a half-forgotten hymn, a melody with no name. One morning she stepped outside alone. The crutches sank slightly into the soft dirt, but she held steady. The air tasted like pine and ash, and she let it fill her lungs without trembling. Birds chattered in the high branches. A squirrel darted across the stones near the woodpile. The ridge felt larger than it had from inside, but not hostile. Not anymore. Caleb watched from inside, but didn't follow. She could feel his presence behind the curtain, but he stayed still, giving her the dignity of solitude. That evening, she returned to the porch just as the sun dipped low. Her face was flushed. Her arms ached, but she smiled just a little, just for herself. The next day, the town came back for her. They arrived around noon, dust rising from 2 horses and a buckboard rattling behind. Ezra Tanner rode at the front, his belly pressing against the buttons of his stained vest. His eyes were red-rimmed and mean. Ruth sat stiffly beside him, her lips pursed like they'd never known softness. Sheriff Boone followed on his own horse, eyes shaded, jaw clenched with unease. Caleb saw them before they reached the fence. He stepped off the porch slowly, arms crossed, eyes steady. Clara inside froze where she stood. Ezra was the first to speak. "You got our kin Ward," he called. "She ran from home. We're here to take her back." Caleb said nothing. Ruth leaned forward, face sharp with scorn. "She's got things that don't belong to her. My boy's knife, his ring. She's a liar, and she shamed his memory." Caleb let the silence stretch so long it turned the air brittle. "She didn't run," he said finally. "You threw her away. I picked her up." Boone cleared his throat, clearly regretting his presence. "Caleb, maybe best she comes back for a spell. Let it all cool down. Lot of talk in town. No law says I have to hand her over," Caleb replied. "And no law says you get to ignore what they did." Ezra's hand dropped toward his belt where the grip of a pistol gleamed. "You don't scare me," he spat. "You should be scared of what you did," came a voice from the cabin. Clara stepped out. She wore a borrowed coat over her nightdress. Her crutches braced her like roots. Her face was pale but set. "You broke me," she said. "You left me in the street like a oh, but I didn't die and I'm not coming back." Ezra laughed bitterly. "You think he cares for you? You think this is home?" Clara didn't flinch. "I know what home isn't." Ruth's face turned to stone. "You ungrateful little—" "She's not yours anymore," Caleb interrupted, his voice low. Boone looked between them, then sighed. "Ain't worth fighting. If she wants to stay, that's her say. Unless you've got a court order, you got no hold on her." Ezra cursed under his breath. Ruth hissed like a snake. The wagon turned slow and heavy, and the Tanners rode back toward town without another word. Boone followed, but not before tipping his hat to Clara. When they were gone, silence returned softer than before. Clara sank onto the porch step. Her hands trembled. Caleb sat beside her. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I think I will be." That night, a storm rolled over the ridge. Rain drummed on the roof like distant hooves. Clara stood at the window, watching lightning scratch the sky. She didn't hide, she didn't shiver. Behind her, Caleb stoked the fire. She turned toward him and said, Thank you. He looked up, and for the first time he smiled, barely there, but warm enough to break something open in the dark. You don't owe me that, he said. I know, she replied, but I want to give it anyway. Later, as sleep crept into her bones, she lay still and listened not for threats or footsteps, but for the quiet hum of something new being born. It was fragile, yes, but not empty. There was space in it, space for breath, for rest, for whatever came next. And though the rain fell heavy, she did not dream of drowning. She dreamed of standing. The days softened into one another like threads in a worn quilt stitched not with ease, but by the slow, deliberate hands of healing. Spring, cautious and gray, at first began to bleed green into the hills around the cabin. Buds bloomed like held-in laughter, finally let go. In the still mornings when mist curled between the trees and birds sang with uncertain joy, Clara June Tanner walked. Not far, not fast, but she walked crutches, tucked under each arm, her stride stiff but growing in rhythm. She moved down the slope toward the creek with the steady resolve of someone who had once been broken and had no intention of being broken again. Her steps carved truth into the soil. I am still here. I am still becoming. Caleb Ward rarely walked beside her. He knew when to give space, but he watched from the porch with the quiet pride of a man who'd long ago stopped hoping for much only to be proven wrong. He carved while he waited. Bits of oak, cedar, and bone passed through his hands and came out as birds leave simple shapes that fit in the palm. Clara never asked where he learned it. She only knew that each time she stepped back through the door, a new carving would be waiting near the hearth. The bird was her favorite, small with wings poised to take flight. Town remained a distant shape beyond the ridge. Clara had not returned, not even once. She knew the faces there hadn't changed, only their expressions. Pity replaced scorn, but it tasted no sweeter. Still, the world had a way of inching back into even the safest places. One morning, a boy, no older than 9, left a bundle at their gate, eggs wrapped in clean cloth and a hand-scrawled note for the Lark Lady. Caleb said nothing. Clara only smiled. Later, the boy's father, the blacksmith, passed by on horseback. He didn't stop, but he nodded toward the porch. It was the first kindness from town that hadn't come wrapped in curiosity or shame. Clara began to braid her hair again. Her dresses fit looser, now her frame leaner, more wiry, but there was strength in her back, a steadiness in her fingers as she shelled peas. As she stirred the evening stew, Caleb watched her move about the cabin and noticed the silence was no longer heavy. It was companionable, like two dogs lying in the same patch of sun. They spoke more often now, not about the bumped, never about Amos, never about the Tanners, but about the land, the weather, the strange calls of birds at dusk. She asked about elk once, and Caleb told her how they moved in quiet herds through the dawn, how the earth would hum before you ever saw them. His voice grew softer as he spoke, remembering the weight of antlers and the sound of something wild and massive simply existing. Do you miss it? She asked. He thought for a long moment. No, he said. I miss what it made me feel, like the world was bigger than the sorrow I carried. Clara understood that. She felt it too when the wind touched her face just right, or when the creek leapt over the stones. The world hadn't stopped turning the day she was broken. She had, but now something inside her was learning how to turn again. Her legs still ached when storms rolled in. The bone had mended, but the memory of pain lingered like smoke. Still she moved. She even danced once barefoot slowly in the fading light of evening. A lopsided spin across the clearing while Caleb chopped wood. He stopped, watched her for a long beat, then went back to work without a word. But that night she found fresh sagebrush on her windowsill. It wasn't love, not the kind stories told of. It was something gentler, quieter, a recognition. Two souls scarred in different ways, leaning against the same tree and realizing it held them both. Then without warning, the Tanners returned. It was late afternoon when the rumble of hooves stirred the dust near the base of the hill. Claire was inside sorting dried beans. Caleb stood at the door, jaw tight, as 3 riders emerged. Ezra Tanner at the front, his eyes sharp with something darker than anger. Behind him, a man Clara didn't recognize, and a third with a long rifle slung across his back. They didn't call out this time. Caleb stepped off the porch. Thought you were told she wasn't coming back, he said, voice steady. Ezra dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a thud. We're not here for talk. The stranger beside him shifted. His coat was fine city-tailored, but his eyes were cold and clear. Mercenaries, Caleb thought. Bought muscle. The third man said nothing. Just watched the cabin like it offended him. Inside, Clara froze. She knew that sound the way Ezra moved when no one stood in his way, the smell of fire when it wasn't in the hearth. I want what's mine, Ezra said. Amos's knife, his books, the rest of my kin's belongings. She ain't got any of that, Caleb replied. I don't believe you. Caleb didn't move. His hands stayed at his sides. Empty. Go home, Ezra, he said. You're a bitter man, but even you can see what this is. What this is, Ezra growled, is theft. And I won't be made a fool. He stepped forward. The mercenary raised his rifle. Then the wind changed. Smoke from behind the cabin. Clara smelled it first. Sharp wrong. She turned and saw the flicker of flame through the rear window. Her breath caught. They'd set the barn alight. Caleb turned too late. Ezra had moved closer. The man with the rifle now raised it full to his shoulder, eyes narrowing. Let it burn, Ezra barked. Let her watch everything fall. But Clara stepped through the door. Her hands trembled on her crutches, but her face was carved from stone. Stop, she said, voice louder than she'd known it could be. All three men turned. She doesn't have anything of value, Caleb said again, stepping in front of her. I do, Clara said quietly. I have my name, Ezra sneered. A name don't matter when no one believes it. Maybe not in town, she replied, but here it does. The rifleman hesitated. The other stranger shifted in his saddle. Then from behind the smoke came another sound. Hooves again, but not from the Tanner's party. The blacksmith. Two more townsmen, Sheriff Boone trailing behind. They'd seen the smoke. Or maybe they'd seen enough silence. Boone dismounted slowly. That's arson, Ezra. She's a thief, Ezra spat. She's a survivor, the blacksmith cut in. And you ought to ride before that fire spreads to more than wood. Ezra's mouth opened closed. He looked between them all. For the first time, he looked small, old, like something hollow, trying to pretend it was full. He mounted his horse without another word. The others followed. No gunfire, no threats, just a fire crackling behind them, eating what little they still had. Clara sagged once they were gone. Caleb caught her before she could fall. She didn't cry. Not then. Later, when the fire was out and the sky was bruised with smoke, she stood where the barn had been. Only embers remained. Her hands hung at her sides. Caleb stood beside her, and the others stayed behind quiet. I should be angry, she said. You're allowed. I just feel free. He looked at her surprised. They burned the last piece of who I used to be, she continued. Now I don't have to carry any of it. Caleb didn't respond, but he reached into his coat, pulled something out, a small carving, a flame shape from red cedar still warm from his pocket. She held it in her palm, ran her fingers along its grooves. Still standing, he said, still learning how she replied. And in that moment, the loss didn't feel like an end. It felt like clearing, like the forest after fire. Blackened, yes, but ready. Ready for something new. The wind was different that morning. It no longer carried the chill of uncertainty or the heaviness of dread. It smelled like creek water and wildflowers, like a season turning with purpose. Clara stood in the garden bed behind the cabin, her legs strong enough now to bear her weight without crutches. A slight limp remained, but she wore it like a mark of passage, not a wound. The sun warmed her skin and her fingers were dirt-streaked as she tucked seeds into the soil, patting it gently as if whispering a secret. Caleb watched from the porch, arms crossed. He didn't speak often, not unless something needed saying, but she had come to understand his silences. They were full of meaning. That morning, his stillness spoke of peace. He began carving less, fixing more, patching the roof, mending the fence, reinforcing the chicken coop that hadn't held chickens in years. It was a rhythm of partnership. They rarely touched, but the space between them was filled with knowing. Inside the cabin, a pot of stew simmered low, and a fire crackled with the scent of moss. They had fallen into a quiet life. Not easy, not free from ache, but honest, and neither had spoken of the Tanners since the fire. Clara hadn't seen them since that night the barn burned. She no longer woke expecting pain. Her sleep was deep, dreamless, and her mornings arrived with stillness instead of fear. It was just before dusk when the storm returned, not in clouds but in hoofbeats. She heard it first, far off, hollow, like drums wrapped in dust. Caleb heard it too, his eyes narrowed, his body tightening without moving. He stepped off the porch, boots heavy against the earth down the trail. 3 riders approached, not galloping, not hiding. They came with the slow, deliberate menace of men who knew they didn't need to run. Ezra Tanner rode at the center, face gaunt, beard unkempt eyes alight with something brittle and cruel. Beside him was the rifleman from before this time, with a fresh weapon across his back and another man neither of them recognized. Younger lean, sun-scorched with a gunman, by the look of him, the kind paid in silver and silence. Clara stepped to the edge of the garden and did not retreat. She felt her heartbeat rise but didn't move. Her hands curled around the trowel she'd been using, though she knew it was more habit than defense. She didn't need to fight. She had already survived. Caleb stood with his body square to the rider's arms at his sides. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. Ezra reined in first. "I warned you," he said, his voice ragged with dust and venom. "I told you this wasn't finished." "You burned our barn," Caleb replied. "Seems like your warning came late. She stole from us." Ezra barked, pointing toward Clara. "She shamed my family." "She survived your family," Caleb interrupted. "And you couldn't stand it." Ezra's face twitched. His hands tightened on the reins. The young gunman dismounted slowly, brushing his coat back to show the handle of a revolver gleaming beneath. "I ain't here to argue," Ezra said. "She comes with us, or things get messy." Clara stepped forward, her limp slight but unmistakable. "I'm not yours," she said. "I never was." "You were my son's wife," Ezra spat. "I was your servant," she said, eyes unflinching, "until you decided that even that was too much." The rifleman's eyes flicked between the two. He wasn't interested in justice, only payout. The young man cracked his neck and stepped forward, hand hovering near his holster. Caleb didn't blink. "Leave," he said. "Well, that's still a choice." Ezra grinned, but it was all teeth. "We'll take her. You can die defending her or step aside." For a moment, it felt like the entire world went still. Then the young gunman drew. Fast? Too fast. The crack of the shot rang through the trees like thunder echoing off stone. Birds scattered from the treetops. Smoke curled from the pistol barrel, but Caleb had already moved. He lunged not with panic, but precision, pushing Clara behind him. The bullet grazed his side, tearing through the edge of his coat and nicking flesh. Blood bloomed slowly beneath the fabric. Before the second shot came, Caleb fired once. The young gunman crumpled backward, collapsing like a dropped sack of oats. The rifleman lifted his weapon, but Clara was already moving. She grabbed the hot iron from the porch fresh from cooking, forgotten in panic, and hurled it with both hands. It hit the rifleman's wrist with a hiss and a scream. He dropped his weapon, clutching his seared skin. Ezra backed away, eyes wide, hands raised, the coward finally showing through. Caleb stepped forward, bleeding but steady. He aimed his pistol directly at Ezra. "You so much as twitch, I'd drop you," he said, voice low. Ezra swallowed. "This was supposed to scare you." "You already tried that," Caleb said. "Didn't take." Clara approached now, her breath sharp, her voice steady. "You came to kill me. You failed." "She was always trouble," Ezra muttered. "Should have finished it when Amos died. And yet here I am," she said, still standing. Boone arrived just after, called by a neighbor who'd seen the riders heading up the trail. He took one look at the scene, the bodies, the blood, the gun on the ground, and understood more than he let on. He cuffed Ezra, himself silent and unsmiling, and promised to send word to the judge by morning. The rifleman whimpered but didn't speak. The dead man was dragged to the wagon like a sack of meat. Before they left, Boone turned to Clara. "You all right?" She nodded. He looked at Caleb. "You, Caleb Pale from Player Blood Loss, just said, fixin' to be." The wagon rolled away, and with it, the last shadow of the Tanners. Inside the cabin, Clara cleaned the wound. Her hands were steady. Caleb hissed once when she pressed the cloth to his side but didn't complain. She stitched the skin slowly, carefully. They said little, but their silence was full of something new, a shared survival that didn't need explaining. Afterward, he lay on the bed, eyes closed. She sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Outside, night had settled soft and full. No smoke, no hooves, just crickets and wind. "I thought I'd be afraid," she whispered. He opened one eye. "Were you though?" she said. "Not anymore." He smiled, faint and true. "You saved me," she added. "No," he said. "You'd already saved yourself." I just held the door open. They didn't speak of love. It wasn't time. But something deeper passed between them in that moment. Something rooted in the soil of hard days and harder choices. The kind of connection that didn't bloom fast, but when it did, held strong against storms. A week passed, then two. The garden grew. The roof no longer leaked. the wind came back clean. And on one morning when the sky blushed pink and the birds called, soft in the trees, Clara June Tanner stepped outside and stood tall, barefoot in the grass with no limp at all. Her dress caught the breeze, her hands were steady. She turned toward the porch toward Caleb, who stood in the doorway holding a coffee cup and watching her like a man seeing the first sun after a long cold night. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He nodded once and she smiled back. Somewhere inside her something whispered, "You made it. You endured and you did not break." And she believed it because now the world no longer hurt the way it once had. It was still sharp, still full of memory and shadow. But now it also held space for her. And for the first time in her life, Clara June Tanner stepped forward, not as someone rescued, not as someone rebuilding, but simply as someone whole, still standing, still free. Not every rescue comes with guns drawn. Sometimes salvation wears silence and patience. And sometimes the broken carry each other until one day they don't feel broken at all. So if the world casts you out, remember this. There's always one soul out there, stubborn enough to see your worth, even in the dust. And when that soul finds you, stand tall, even if you have to learn how to stand all over again. In the months that followed, Clara began to weave her own patterns into the life of the ridge. She planted a small herb garden, sage and thyme, their scents mingling with the pine. She learned to mend Caleb's old coats, her stitches small and sure. One evening she baked cornbread, golden and warm, and left a piece by his plate with a sprig of sage tucked beside it. Caleb didn't say much, but his eyes softened, and he ate slowly, savoring each bite. The town began to shift too in small ways. The blacksmith's wife sent a basket of apples one crisp morning, no note, just the fruit. Clara baked a pie and sent it back with the boy, who grinned shyly before running off. These were quiet gestures, not apologies but acknowledgments. Bitter Creek was learning to see her not as the broken girl left in the dust, but as Clara, the one who stood again. And on a clear evening, as the stars burned bright above the ridge, Clara sat on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, and carved her own small figure from a piece of cedar, a tiny larkwing spread. She left it by Caleb's chair. No words, just the gift. He held it in his palm the next morning, turning it over. And for the first time, Clara saw him laugh, a low, quiet sound that felt like spring. They were not whole, not yet, but they were healing together in a place where the wind sang of second chances.